able to work with the Carter Center. They're known for international election observation. This is their first large effort in the United States. I think they've done a couple of smaller things just in cities like in Georgia, Atlanta, Phoenix, some specific observations. But this is basically their first larger scope looking at a state process, nonpartisan election observation in the United States.
The full and free exercise of our sacred right and duty to vote is more important in the long run than the personal hopes or ambitions of any candidate for any office in the land.
You're listening to High Turnout, Wide Margins, an insider's look at election administration hosted by Brianna Lennon and Eric Fay.
All right, everyone, welcome to another exciting episode of High Turnout, Wide Margins. I'm Eric Fay, Director of Elections in St. Louis County, Missouri, with my co-host,
Brianna Lennon. I'm the County Clerk for Boone County, Missouri.
And today our guest is, Jeff, if you go ahead and introduce yourself.
You bet. Jeff Mangan from the great state of Montana.
And Jeff, what's your current role?
Well, my current role, I do a couple of different things. I work for Microsoft. I do a little consulting on democracy and strategic planning, things like that. But the role I'm here to talk to you about is I was asked to co-chair the Montana Election Observation Initiative and with the support of the Carter Center, and we just kicked that off, and excited to talk to you about that.
So the first question that we always ask any guests that we have on the show is how they got involved in elections in the first place. So what was your pathway and how you ended up doing this pilot program?
So a little bit of background myself. In the early 2000s, late 1999 to 2005, I served in the Montana legislature. I was both a representative and a state senator. And in 2017, I was appointed Montana's Commissioner of Political Practices, which is a one-term only role that lasts 6 years. So basically, in the end of the last 2 years of my term, with all the election 2020, 2021, 22 stuff going on, as part of my role, as part of my role, we were responsible for election compliance. So any election problems, issues, complaints went through my office, and we worked with the Secretary of State on that. So as you can imagine, there was a lot of election stuff going on in the end at that period. And I just became an advocate talking about local election administrators, supporting what they do and how they do it. And when my term was up, I continued to work and support elections, and the Carter Center came calling, and that's kind of how I got here.
Jeff, if you would, I think this role you mentioned, the Commissioner of Political Practices, I think it was, that at least the title seems pretty unique. I bet a lot of folks listening would like to understand more about that, even if that's not the thrust of this episode necessarily. Could you explain what that all entails in Montana?
You bet. The Commissioner of Political Practices is just one commissioner. Some states may have a board or a panel of 3 to several commissioners. Montana is unique that it only has one commissioner, appointed by the governor, confirmed by the Montana State Senate. And they're responsible for enforcement of campaign finance laws, state ethics laws, and state lobbying laws. So as part of the campaign finance piece, within that section of code, lies a number of election laws as well. So enforcement of some election laws goes through the Commissioner of Political Practices office. So it's a very small agency in the state of Montana, very independent. And the governor appoints a commissioner for a 6-year term, can only serve once, one term, and it covers, clearly it would cover, 2 different governors, perhaps, which is the case of mine, appointed by Governor Bullock, and then Governor Gianforte was elected, and I served the last 2 years of my term was under Governor Governor Gianforte.
So kind of transitioning to the pilot that you are co-directing in Missoula. Can you talk a little bit about, honestly, what piqued your interest in working on a domestic election observation kind of, I guess you'd call it a mission. When it's domestic, I think it's hard to call it a mission, but internationally, I think there's people that are used to, well, you go to places where democracy might not be working super great, and that's why you're going to do these missions. And why is it that you're working on this, and why is it important that Missoula is engaging in this pilot?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's not Missoula. That just happens to be where we did the pilot initial observation. It's a statewide effort. It's the state of Montana. But last year, in the spring of 2023, the Carter Center sent out a consultant to Montana and interviewed a number of different folks, including myself, about the possibility of doing nonpartisan election observation in the state of Montana. And I was glad that they called me, listened intently, reinforced the heck out of them selecting Montana as a potential state if they were indeed going to do domestic, a nonpartisan election observation. And that happened in the spring, hadn't heard anything. And then in January of this year, the Carter Center called me, said they selected Montana as one of the states that they wanted to do a nonpartisan election observation in. Asked if I'd co-chair the committee and assist in organizing the effort, and I said yes, and have been working on it ever since.
So can you talk a little bit about the specific election that just passed? I know that there's been a preliminary report issued, and if you could talk a little bit about what election it was that the pilot covered for now.
So when we basically kicked off this effort in February, as the Carter Center was looking for staff, as I was looking for advisory board members and taking a look when we could, would this be an effort we did in the primary and general, or just the general, for example. Once we started organizing, it was decided that the best bet would be to kind of do a pilot, select one county in the state of Montana to do a pilot to basically test tools, test processes, make sure that the forms and the tools that we were going to use would do what we wanted, would gather the data and the information that would be helpful to the citizens and the state. And then after that pilot, determine whether or not how we go forward into the general. So the initial, we just expected to have a couple of observers, have folks come out from the Carter Center, have a couple of the advisory board members join us, and just literally just test tools. But when we put the word out that we wanted to do this in Missoula County, we selected Missoula County for a number of different reasons. One, we know it's a well-run, it has a reputation to be a well-run election. They really run elections well. I knew the election administrator. They have lots of information and just about their own processes out. As well, it's a college town, Missoula, Montana. So we figured there could be plenty of volunteers, hopefully. So that's the reason we selected Missoula. We ended up getting enough volunteers to observe in 19 of the 21 polling places across the county. Between myself, advisory board members, Carter Center members, and approximately 15 to 18 community members. We were able to not only test our tools and test the processes, we were actually able to have enough data to submit to analyze the data and submit a statement of findings. So we were pretty excited about that.
Yeah, the scope is definitely unique in that even in states where this is allowed, there probably have not been very robust efforts to have a systematic nonpartisan observation. So, which gets to the heart of my question. A lot of folks that listen to this podcast are election administrators themselves, and they're probably wondering if this effort comes to my jurisdiction, what does that mean? Your folks that are at one of our polling locations and they see something, do they report us to the election police? What in practical terms, what does this look like for an election administrator?
When I was asked to co-chair and to help organize, I wanted to do one thing. I wanted to make sure that everything that we do is transparent. We wanted to make sure we work with local election officials and have good communication. So the first thing I did is reach out to a friend of mine, a colleague, Representative Geraldine Custer, who served in the Montana legislature up until 2021, I believe. But she's also, her previous background, she was served over 30 years as a clerk and recorder in a small county in Montana, in Rosebud County. So she was an election administrator for 30-some years. She agreed to co-chair with me this effort, and we've been working together ever since. And then I reached out to 3 other election administrators whom I'd worked with, who are no longer election administrators in the state of Montana for a number of reasons, primarily because of what happened in 2020, 2021, and who agreed to join our effort in an advisory capacity role. So we really focused on doing this from an election perspective, a process perspective from both sides, and not just going in and say, oh, we know what we're doing. We're going to. We really wanted to make sure that it was handled correctly, that we understood the laws of the state of Montana, and that we could provide data at the end of this that would benefit everybody, particularly since there has, just the vitriol sometimes around elections lately and election misinformation. It was important to us that we follow the rules, do everything correctly, and involve folks that know what the heck they're doing in elections. So it really is from an election administrator perspective that we organized this and set this up. With that, we were able to work with the Carter Center under, like you said, that they're known for international election observation. This is their first large effort in the United States. I think they've done a couple of smaller things just in cities like in Georgia, Atlanta, Phoenix, some specific observations. But this is basically their first larger scope looking at a state process, nonpartisan election observation in the United States. So.
Hello, I'm Eric Fay, Director of Elections in St. Louis County, Missouri, and you're listening to High Turnout, Wide Margins, a podcast where we explore local election administration.
I know with the goals being to increase public trust and voter confidence, especially in light of what happened in 2020, 2021, there's also these pushes kind of nationally to change the actual processes and policies that are happening in elections. And I am curious if any of the observation work that you're doing, if there's any sort of intention to kind of look at process improvement as well as just observation, or if the goal at this point is really just to see, these are the benchmarks that they're supposed to hit based on what the law says that they should be doing. Here are any of the kind of issues that we had, whether they're important issues or whether they, were okay, they were just one-off things, or if it really is at some point like, hey, we saw this in Missoula, but then when we were observing in New Mexico, we saw this, and maybe Missoula would want to implement some things we saw in New Mexico. Do you see that on the horizon or as part of this conversation?
We're just going to provide what we observed, and we're not going to, we're not necessarily going to make recommendations for changes in legislation. We all understand that human error occurs. We're working with primarily, election offices are working with primarily volunteers. Election judges, poll workers are a very important part of the process. And things are going to happen. And if through our observation, if we report on things that an election administrator or a legislator or a local government official would see and read and say, oh, maybe that's something we should take a look at in our training. Maybe that's something we should spend more time on. Maybe that's something we should take to the legislature this next year based on this data. So I think the more information we provide, that stuff's just going to happen organically. We don't necessarily have to make a recommendation. The work that you guys do, the election administrators, you're very savvy, very smart. You understand how the process works. And if you hear or see something that would be beneficial to how you do your job or could make it better, we trust that you're going to take that information and do something with it. There just hasn't been, at least in Montana, a larger widespread effort to gather that data and present that information in a way that a county election office, an election administrator, a legislator, a citizen, a group could say, oh, this is the information we need to make our process better or more smooth or change this.
Jeff, can you talk about the scope of your activities? And what I mean by that is you've explained your goal is to have folks at polling locations during voting times, but are you also trying to look at processes within election offices, like how they, for instance, mail ballots or how they're tabulating ballots or other things like that? And do you have visibility over those aspects, and do you hope to?
Great question. We intend to watch the entire process. So in Missoula, in the pilot, for example, and we have tools for each one of those activities. So we started with the pre-election process. Montana has, is an absentee ballot state, 80, in Missoula County, they expected, approximated 85% of voting would take place absentee. I think statewide, the last number I heard was close, maybe 70, 75%. So a majority of folks in Montana are voting absentee. And so we want to ensure that we're watching, with that pre-election process, from reconciliation, tabulation, what they, how they handle the ballots when they come into the election office, to the start of tabulation the day before the election. Clearly, the polls are still an important part of this process, and what's happening is the polls, and then post-election audit, and then post-election canvass. We are observing every step of that process that the county is doing. So the report that the findings that we released so far, the statement of findings were basically just from observation on polling day, on the election day. But we will be releasing a larger report on all of those processes. So the whole thing is important. The whole process is important. It's not only. And plus the other part of all this, I should have mentioned this at the beginning, it's the reason you guys do what you do with the podcast, I imagine. Another benefit of this is just education. Can we assist in educating the public on how election offices work, how voting offices work, how the laws in the state of Montana are designed to provide trust and confidence in when citizens vote. So we see education as a big part of what we do when we release the report and start talking about these issues.
I actually was going to ask about public perception of this pilot, because I noted in the preliminary report that got put out, there were some instances where voters were noted as being mildly disruptive, like not a lot to make a difference, but just notes like a person was wearing a hat and was electioneering and was upset when told to take it off, which was in compliance with the law. So they did the right thing, but they were upset. Is there any? It's great that I think people were so engaged and happy that you all were there. Is there any plan that you know of, or do you know if the election administrator in Missoula is going to use it as like a community outreach education tool? Because I feel like if you read through a domestic observation report, like the preliminary report that came out, it shows all of the different things that election administrators know that happens all the time. It's not unusual to see, oh yeah, that voter got upset because of a hat and things like that. And we try to communicate those things to the public, like this is a normal thing. These are things to expect. But I feel like maybe in report format from a trusted nonpartisan source, it may sink in a little bit more. It might be a nice tool to use for community engagement. Do you foresee that happening?
I think if we do our jobs right, not only will we increase confidence in our election process, not only will provide some level of education, but I think the county and the election offices could likely use it for recruitment of election judges and poll workers, and wanting to learn more about how that process works, or just observe themselves in some capacity, whether volunteering with us or partisan election observers have been part of the process. It's there's a reason that they're there. And if they can learn something about how this works, even through that partisan lens, that's good too. So it was in this particular election, Missoula is one of our larger counties. The only election observers basically that were there were us. There weren't partisan election observers. There weren't, I think there was one public person, one public observer that came in one of the locations to observe. But so for all of the rhetoric and chatter out there, no one seems to want to come in and see it for themselves, for example, unless they're election judges, poll workers, those type of things. So yeah, absolutely, this can help. Provide that data, that information to election administrators so that they can go back to their community and say, this is what a nonpartisan independent election observer seen. This is how we do things. Because of this report, this is what we're going to change, or this is what we're not going to, this is how we run elections, and we welcome you to come assist us in whatever capacity you can.
Was there anything that we didn't ask that you want to make sure that we include?
Going into my last 2 years, when all this stuff started happening, it's like I couldn't believe people were talking about election offices in certain ways. For years, Montana, everyone loved their election office, loved their election administrators, loved their poll workers, and their election volunteers and judges. They were their neighbors, their co-workers, people they saw every day. Some they voted for. Some were appointed by the county, for example. For 100 years, we loved that. And then all of a sudden, in a period of less than a year, it's just turned on its head. So it didn't matter what the party was, if there was an elected official, but because of a concern of a machine or a meme on Facebook somewhere, or we can't trust what's happening in this count, things just drastically changed, and it just boggles my mind because it's the same thing as it was for those first 100 years. It's our friends, our neighbors, our coworkers, and people we've known for years in our community, people we recognized when we went into the poll locations and saw and could say, hi, how you doing? How was church? How was this? How was that? And for us not to even look at it that way in that same lens is just, and continue that narrative when no evidence of anything of any wrongdoing, is even there. But to continue that narrative, I think it's just really important that we get back to here's what's happening, here's how they work. These are the facts. This is what we saw. We don't have an axe to grind. This is still your friend, your coworker, your neighbor, the person you go to church with, that are coming together from all across the community to make sure that this works for you. It hasn't, it's the same as happened, 100 years ago.
You've been listening to High Turnout, Wide Margins, a podcast that explores local election administration. I'm your host, Eric Fay, alongside Brianna Lennon. A big thanks to KBIA and the Election Center for making this podcast possible. Our managing editor is Rebecca Smith, managing producer is Aaron Hay, our associate producer is Katie Quinn, and our digital producer is Mark Johnson. This has been High Turnout, Wide Margins. Thanks for listening.